Why do humans across completely different cultures keep worshiping mountains? Across religions, civilizations, and thousands of years of history, humans repeatedly arrived at the same idea. Certain mountains were places of the divine. And what makes that so strange is that this idea kept appearing completely independently across the globe, all treating mountains as places connected to something beyond the human world, almost like it is some kind of universal human instinct. And that made me start wondering, why is that? Why mountains specifically? And why did certain mountains become spiritually important while countless others were simply ignored? So I started looking through examples of sacred mountains across history and across the world, searching for the answer. And the deeper I went, the more it felt like each mountain revealed another piece of the puzzle. So, I invite you to join me on this journey through some of the most sacred mountains on Earth, because each one will bring us closer to understanding why humans across history became so obsessed with mountains in the first place, and by the last mountain, we should have the full answer. And to begin that journey, we have to go back around 3,000 years to ancient Greece, where one mountain was believed to be the literal home of the gods. Mount Olympus rises to 2,917 meters, or 9,570 feet, above northern Greece, making it the highest mountain in the country. And for the ancient Greeks, that height mattered, because from the surrounding plains, Olympus dominates the landscape so completely that it genuinely feels separated from the normal world. Its upper slopes are frequently hidden by clouds and storms, and in ancient times, very few people would have ever seen its summit closely, and that isolation became mythology. The ancient Greeks believed Olympus was the home of the 12 Olympian gods, ruled by Zeus himself. According to their beliefs, the summit existed beyond the reach of ordinary humans, hidden above the clouds where the gods watched over the world below. And what makes this mountain so important for our investigation is that Olympus already reveals one of the first major patterns behind sacred mountains. Height creates separation. The mountain physically rises above human civilization, above cities, forests, and ordinary life itself. And once humans started associating the sky with gods or the heavens, the highest places in the landscape naturally began feeling closer to the divine, almost like elevation itself carried spiritual meaning. But as this idea spread across completely different civilizations, mountains stopped being seen only as homes of gods. In some cultures, they became places where humans believed they could directly communicate with the divine themselves. From ancient Greece, we now move south into the deserts of the Middle East, where sacred mountains took on a completely different meaning. Because instead of being seen simply as the homes of gods, mountains are also places of isolation, revelation, and direct connection between humans and the divine. And few mountains in human history became more important because of that than this one. Mount Sinai rises to around 2,285 meters, or 7,497 feet, above the Sinai Peninsula, in one of the driest and most isolated landscapes in the Middle East. And unlike Mount Olympus, Sinai did not become sacred because people believed gods lived on its summit permanently. Instead, the mountain became sacred because of something that was believed to happen there. According to the Bible, Mount Sinai was the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments from God after leading the Israelites out of Egypt. The mountain later became sacred not only in Judaism, but also in Christianity and Islam, making it one of the most spiritually important mountains anywhere on Earth. And what makes Sinai especially important for this investigation is how different its sacredness feels compared to Olympus. Because Sinai introduces another pattern that appears repeatedly across religions and civilizations: isolation. The mountain rises out of a vast desert landscape almost completely separated from major population centers. Even today, reaching the summit usually requires a long climb through barren rocky terrain, often in darkness before sunrise. And throughout history, mountains like this repeatedly became associated with revelation, meditation, prophecy, and spiritual encounters. Almost as if humans believed distance from civilization itself made contact with the divine more possible. Because the higher and farther people climbed away from ordinary human life, the more sacred the experience itself seemed to become. From the deserts of the Middle East, we now move to an island nation shaped by volcanoes, earthquakes, and mountains that have dominated the landscape for thousands of years. And over time, one of those mountains became so spiritually important that millions of people eventually began climbing it for reasons far beyond simply reaching the summit. Mount Fuji rises to 3,776 meters, or 12,389 feet, above central Japan, making it the highest mountain in the country. And unlike many mountains on this list, Fuji is impossible to separate from the civilization around it. For centuries, the volcano has dominated the Japanese landscape so completely that it became far more than just a mountain. It appeared constantly in art, religion, poetry, and daily life, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable natural landmarks on Earth. But what makes Fuji especially important for this investigation is how people interacted with it. Because over time, climbing the mountain itself became a spiritual act. In Japanese Shinto beliefs, mountains were often associated with kami, spiritual beings or forces connected to nature. Fuji eventually became one of the most sacred examples of this idea, with shrines built around its base and religious pilgrimages developing around the ascent itself. And for centuries, many people did not climb Fuji simply to stand on the summit. They climbed it as a form of purification. The physical act of ascending the mountain, suffering through exhaustion, cold, altitude, and distance from ordinary life became part of the spiritual meaning itself. Entire religious groups known as Fuji-ko formed around pilgrimages to the mountain, believing the climb brought spiritual transformation. And this reveals another major pattern that keeps appearing throughout our journey. Mountains naturally separate humans from normal life. The higher people climb, the farther they move away from cities, comfort, noise, and routine. And across completely different cultures, humans repeatedly started associating that separation with spirituality itself. But as sacred mountains continued appearing across different civilizations, some became connected not only to transformation or pilgrimage, but to moments believed to have changed human history entirely. From the volcanic landscapes of Japan, we now move back into the deserts of the Middle East, where another mountain would eventually become one of the most spiritually important places in the Islamic world. And the deeper this investigation goes, the more mountains start appearing not just as part of the landscape, but as places humans repeatedly turn to in moments of spiritual searching. Jabal al-Nour rises to around 640 meters, or 2,100 feet above the desert surrounding Mecca, in present-day Saudi Arabia. Compared to many mountains on this list, it is not especially tall, massive, or visually overwhelming. And that actually makes its importance even more interesting, because Jabal al-Nour, meaning Mountain of Light, did not become sacred because people believed gods lived there, or because it towered dramatically above the landscape. It became sacred because humans intentionally went there searching for something deeper. Near the summit of the mountain, there is a small cave known as the Cave of Hira. According to Islamic tradition, this was the place where the Prophet Muhammad received the first revelations of the Quran through the angel Gabriel. But before that happened, Muhammad was already retreating into the mountains alone to meditate and separate himself from the noise and pressures of daily life in Mecca. And this reveals another pattern. Humans repeatedly use mountains as places to search for meaning. Places removed from distraction, society, and ordinary life, where people go to think, meditate, or seek spiritual clarity. And strangely enough, this behavior appears across completely different religions and civilizations, even when they had absolutely no contact with one another. But as sacred mountains became tied not only to revelation or meditation, some of them transformed into something even larger, symbols powerful enough to shape the identity of entire civilizations themselves. From the deserts surrounding Mecca, we now move toward the mountains of ancient Persia, where sacred mountains became tied not only to spirituality or revelation, but to mythology itself. Because across many civilizations, mountains did not just become places connected to gods. They became places where humans believed the forces shaping the world itself were hidden. Mount Damavand rises to 5,610 meters, or 18,406 feet above northern Iran, making it the highest volcano in Asia and the tallest mountain in the Middle East outside the Caucasus. And unlike some sacred mountains that became important because of specific religious events, Damavand became sacred through mythology. For thousands of years, the mountain has played a central role in Persian legends, literature, and identity. In the Persian epic Book of Kings, one of the most important works in Iranian history, Damavand is described as the place where the tyrant king Zahak was imprisoned forever after being defeated by the hero Faradin. According to the legend, Zahak was not simply an evil ruler. He was portrayed almost as a supernatural force of chaos itself, and Damavand became the place where that force was sealed away beneath the mountain. And this reveals another pattern that keeps appearing throughout our investigation. Humans repeatedly use mountains as containers for mythology, and across civilizations, humans kept projecting their greatest fears, gods, demons, and stories onto mountains, almost as if landscapes this enormous demanded explanations larger than ordinary human life. From the mountains of ancient Persia, we now move deep into the Australian outback, to a place that has been spiritually important for thousands of years to the Aboriginal peoples living around it. And what makes this place especially interesting is that, compared to the enormous mountains we have seen so far, it almost seems out of place in this story entirely. Uluru rises to around 348 meters, or 1,142 feet above the surrounding desert in the center of Australia. And compared to many places on this list, Uluru does not look especially tall or overwhelming. It is not covered in snow, it does not dominate an entire mountain range, and technically, it is not even a mountain at all, but a massive sandstone rock formation standing almost alone in the Australian outback. Yet for thousands of years, it has remained one of the most sacred places anywhere in Australia. To the Anangu people, the traditional Aboriginal custodians of the region, Uluru is deeply connected to the Dreamtime, a complex spiritual system explaining the creation of the world, human existence, and the landscape itself. According to these beliefs, many of the rock's physical features were formed by ancestral beings during creation stories passed down across generations. And what makes Uluru especially important in our journey is that it changes one of the assumptions we may have formed so far. Because until now, sacred mountains often became important because they felt elevated, isolated, physically dominant, or connected to mythology and revelation. But Uluru suggests something deeper. Humans do not only attach spiritual meaning to height, they attach it to presence. In the middle of an otherwise relatively flat desert landscape, Uluru rises so abruptly and so distinctly from the surrounding terrain that it becomes almost impossible to ignore. For thousands of years, people living around it would have constantly seen it dominating the horizon, standing apart from everything around it. And across civilizations, humans repeatedly transform these kinds of unique natural landmarks into places connected to creation, ancestors, and the spiritual world itself. Because the more a place feels separated from ordinary landscape, the more humans seem to instinctively search for meaning within it. But as this pattern continued across different cultures, some societies eventually took the idea even further. From the deserts of Central Australia, we now move to southern India, where one mountain became sacred in a way fundamentally different from almost everything we have seen so far. Because in some cultures, the mountain was no longer seen as a place connected to the divine. The mountain itself became the divine. Arunachala rises to around 814 meters, or 2,671 feet above southern India, near the city of Tiruvannamalai, in the state of Tamil Nadu. And unlike many sacred mountains we have explored so far, Arunachala is not believed to be the home of a god, or the place where a divine event once happened. In Hindu tradition, the mountain itself is considered a physical manifestation of Shiva, one of the most important deities in Hinduism. According to Hindu mythology, Shiva once appeared as an enormous pillar of fire stretching infinitely into the sky and deep into the earth, beyond human comprehension. Arunachala is believed to represent that cosmic form in physical reality, and this changes the pattern once again, because throughout much of human history, sacred mountains often acted as bridges between humans and the divine, but here, the distinction almost disappears completely. The mountain itself becomes sacred by existing. For centuries, millions of pilgrims have traveled to Arunachala, not necessarily to climb it, but to walk around it in a ritual known as Girivalam, a pilgrimage route roughly 14 kilometers or 8.7 miles long surrounding the base of the mountain. During major festivals, enormous crowds gather there believing the mountain itself carries spiritual power. And what makes this especially important in our journey is that Arunachala reveals how humans often stop viewing certain landscapes as symbols. Instead, they begin treating them almost as living entities, not just part of nature, but something conscious, eternal, and spiritually active. From southern India, we now move thousands of kilometers west into the high Andes of South America, where one sacred mountain still towers above isolated communities living at extreme altitude. And unlike many sacred mountains we have explored so far, this one became deeply connected to something every civilization depends on. Ausangate rises to 6,384 meters, or 20,945 feet, in the Peruvian Andes, making it one of the highest mountains anywhere in southern Peru. The mountain became spiritually important because of its direct connection to survival itself. For centuries, the mountain has been considered sacred by Andean communities, many of whom believe powerful spirits known as Apus inhabit certain peaks across the Andes. These mountain spirits were believed to influence weather, water, fertility, and the well-being of the people living below them. And in a place like the Andes, that belief is not difficult to understand, because mountains here literally control life. The glaciers surrounding peaks like this one provide water to communities living across an otherwise harsh, high-altitude environment. Seasonal snowmelt affects agriculture, animals, and survival itself, making the mountain feel less like part of the landscape and more like a force actively shaping human life below it. And even today, thousands of pilgrims still travel into the mountains during the annual Koiler Festival, one of the largest pilgrimages in South America, combining Catholic traditions with much older Andean spiritual beliefs tied directly to the mountains themselves. And this reveals another major pattern in our journey. Humans often begin worshiping the landscapes they depend on most, because when a mountain controls water, weather, fertility, or survival, it naturally becomes more than geography. It becomes something powerful, unpredictable, and deeply connected to human existence itself. From the frozen peaks of the Andes, we now move to East Africa, where one sacred mountain still rises above an active volcanic landscape shaped by fire, ash, and eruptions. And unlike many sacred mountains connected to revelation, pilgrimage, or survival, this one became sacred partly because of the raw destructive power humans witnessed there. Doinyo Lengai rises to 2,962 meters, or 9,718 feet above northern Tanzania, near the eastern branch of the Great Rift Valley. To the Maasai people living around it, the mountain is known as Doinyo Lengai, meaning Mountain of God. And compared to many sacred mountains on this list, its spiritual importance is tied directly to something humans have feared for thousands of years: volcanic eruptions. Unlike ordinary mountains, Doinyo Lengai is still an active volcano and one of the strangest anywhere on Earth. It produces an extremely rare type of lava known as carbonatite lava, which erupts at much lower temperatures than normal lava and appears almost black in daylight before eventually turning white as it cools. And for people living near the mountain long before modern geology, landscapes like this would have felt terrifying. The ground shakes, smoke rises from the summit, ash falls from the sky. Entire slopes can suddenly erupt with fire and molten rock. And this reveals another major pattern in our journey. Humans often begin worshiping what they fear. Because mountains are not only beautiful or isolated, they are also dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of destruction on a scale far beyond human control. And across civilizations, humans repeatedly transform that fear into spirituality, mythology, and reverence, almost as if sacredness itself became a way of explaining or respecting forces too powerful to fully understand. But by this point in our journey, one final question still remains. What happens when a mountain combines almost all of these ideas at once? From the volcanic landscapes of East Africa, we now move deep into the Himalayas, to a mountain that may be the single most sacred mountain anywhere on Earth. And after everything we have explored so far, this final mountain almost feels like the point where all of these patterns come together. Mount Kailash rises to 6,638 meters, or 21,778 feet above the remote western Tibetan Plateau. And despite not even being among the tallest mountains in the Himalayas, Mount Kailash became one of the most sacred mountains anywhere on Earth. What makes that especially remarkable is that this happened across multiple completely different religions. Hindus believe the mountain is the home of Shiva, Buddhists associate it with the cosmic center of the universe. In Jainism, it is believed to be the place where the first Tirthankara attained enlightenment. And in the ancient Bon religion of Tibet, the mountain was sacred long before Buddhism even arrived in the region, and unlike Everest or most major mountains on Earth, Kailash remains completely unclimbed. Not because reaching the summit is impossible, but because climbing it is considered deeply disrespectful by the religions that revere it. Even many experienced mountaineers have refused to attempt it out of respect for its spiritual significance. And after everything we have explored throughout this journey, Kailash almost feels like the place where all of these patterns finally converge. It is isolated, massive, symmetrical, difficult to reach, surrounded by extreme landscapes, feared, respected, mythologized, and treated as something existing beyond ordinary human life. And maybe that is the answer humans across civilizations kept arriving at again and again. Because mountains naturally feel beyond human scale. They rise above the landscape, they dominate the horizon, they create isolation, danger, perspective, and awe all at once. Long before modern science, they would have felt eternal compared to the civilizations living beneath them. And across completely different cultures, humans repeatedly interpreted those feelings the same way, as something divine. Almost like sacred mountains were never really about the mountains themselves, but about a deeply human instinct to search for meaning in places that make us feel small